On this edition of FedGov Today with Francis Rose, the challenge ahead for clearing up the Pentagon's innovation ecosystem.
If you let 1,000 flowers bloom, you're going to get a lot of weeds in there too, right? So how do you separate the wheat from the chaff?
Former DoD official Jerry McGinn on FedGov Today in just a moment. First, though, one DOTIT is the goal for the Transportation Department's Chief Information Officer. He lists processes, people, and products as part of the path to get to that goal. Pavan Padugu, the CIO at DOT, will tell you about it on the last FedGov Today TV we recorded before the shutdown. You can watch the show now on the FedGov Today YouTube channel anytime, and it's available on our website at fedgovtoday.com. Two significant authorities are in limbo now after they expired at the end of fiscal year 2025. Congress is already looking at how to extend the Small Business Innovation Research Program and the Defense Production Act. Jerry McGinn, director of the Center for the Industrial Base and senior fellow in the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's former acting deputy assistant secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base. Jerry, thanks very much for joining me. It's great to talk to you again. What are the implications of trying to restart these two programs after the shutdown? What will the department need to do to turn things back on, or try to figure out how to move forward with them based on maybe not knowing exactly where they're headed with each of these programs? Welcome, Jerry.
Great to be with you again, Francis. Yes, there are two programs, the Defense Production Act and then Small Business Innovation Research, or SBIR. Let me start with the DPA. The DPA is a presidential authority. So that expired at the end of September. And so when the government comes back, it doesn't, the DPA still is not reauthorized. So you can't do any new projects, even if you have appropriations. You can't use the authority until it's been reauthorized. Existing projects can likely continue that are sort of underway. But it's important that this authority get reauthorized. And it looks like they're going to do essentially a clean reauthorization for a year and then punt the changes to potentially next year. But like I say, that has to be either part of the continuing resolution or separate. But DPA has got to be restarted, which has a critical function in the defense industrial base, which is a major priority for this administration.
What's your long-term view of what has to happen with the SBIR, the Small Business Innovation Research Program, to sustain it long-term? It's the number of discussions about the value that it's added already to the department, but it strikes me some long-term vision's probably required to make sure it's sustainable and resilient.
No, absolutely. Yeah. There are 10 agencies actually that have SBIR, SBIR authority, and it runs out of the Small Business Administration. But, like DOD is half of them, basically about $6 billion a year goes through SBIR contracts, and DOD is half of that. And then the other agencies have the other half. And there's been a lot of discussions right now on how to reform SBIR. And there's a big focus on either addressing what's called the so-called SBIR mills, which are companies that do a lot of SBIR work, or on making it, understanding how the impact of SBIR better. And so there are competing visions on that. So that's been discussions on reauthorizing SBIR. But it's hard to, right now it's not clear which way that's going to go. It's likely to have, at least initially, just a clean reauthorization for a year.
What's your opinion of what a long-term healthy SBIR program looks like, Jerry?
Yeah. I think what's key with the SBIR program is that, they've started to do ways to help companies scale pretty quickly. Because initially the challenge with phase one SBIRs is they're very small. $100,000, $150,000. And the phase twos now are getting much bigger, so they're enable companies to at least get some initial hiring and cash flow to be able to get things going. But the real challenge, which has been with SBIR, is that there's no way to understand which of these projects succeed, what transitions to actual programs of record, and there's no mechanism to measure that other than individually looking at each program. So we need to have a better way to understand how much are we getting out of this innovation. We don't want everything to succeed because you want things to fail, but we don't have a good way to measure that. And so I think that is, I think, the big thing that needs to happen with the SBIR program.
I remember when you were still in the building, and you and I did an interview. I think it was at Sea Air Space or one of those conferences over at the Gaylord, and we talked about that idea of wanting some things to fail, and that was anathema to the culture in the building for a long time. Is it your sense that that has changed, and that people in the department are more open to the idea of trying things, finding they don't work, and moving on to something else?
I think definitely on a intellectual sense, I think that definitely has been absorbed. And you see that in the department really is doing a tremendous job at experimentation and prototyping. You see that with SBIRs, you see that with other transactions authorities, you see that with all these efforts at AFWorks, DIU, and the like. But the challenge is that some of this you got to have you can experiment, but what's the transition mechanism? How do we get beyond experimentation to actual production efforts? And that's where I think we don't really have as good of a ability to either to measure it, or I think there's a little too much focus on speed and not enough focus on scale, and that's kind of. That's sort of, I think, where I think the department can focus going forward.
Is there data that the department should collect, or maybe does collect and doesn't collate and curate well enough? Or is data not the right information to determine how to measure success in this case?
Yeah, see, I mean, the issue is that there aren't really good measures. Well, there are, but there's no way to get after them. Like, the transitioning of SBIR from phases 2 to phase 3, there's no data captured there. There's no data captured on other transactions, how many prototypes then lead to production contracts, either through a production OT or a program of record. So we need to have some better ways to be able to measure it, because you get what you measure, right? But the challenge, and part of the reason why they haven't done this, and this is fair, is that you need things to fail, because if you're only measuring things that you want to succeed, then you're going to be much more reticent to take those risks. And so now we've sort of got to be able to keep taking the risks, but find ways to help understand which ones transition, which ones succeed, so you can learn from them going forward.
So that goes back to that culture issue that I mentioned a few moments ago, though, because I can imagine some poor person in the department getting called before one of the committees of jurisdiction and saying, okay, so we've measured your programs and 40% of them failed, 60% of them failed, and is that acceptable? And if you apply like a venture capital lens, if 40% of the companies that a venture cap firm invested in succeeded, you would just be absolutely ecstatic. And yet in this landscape, one could see where that would be judged to be a tremendous failure.
Yeah. I think that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. And because, I think leaders on Congress and in the department, they say that, yes, they want experimentation. They want to fail fast and exceed. But then sometimes they want to have their cake and eat it too, and say, because if you start measuring things, then it's like, then you're graded on them. So you have to, if you're going to do this and hold people accountable, you have to use a different scale. You've got to use, like you said, the venture capital scale, or something that's really kind of realistic in terms of what are your measures of success.
I guess that's a case of be careful what you wish for. Another item I wanted to go back to, you called out some of the innovation hubs that are across government. You mentioned AFWorks and DIU and some of the others. What's your sense of what the connective tissue looks like to build an innovation ecosystem inside the department and not have these organizations each kind of go in their own direction? I note in particular, one of those places exists in a different form. I won't say it doesn't exist anymore. Army Futures Command was decommissioned recently and merged into TRADOC. And so that looks different. The functions are still being performed in some cases. But as this innovation ecosystem matures, what's your sense of how they're all connected together or going to be connected together so that there's kind of everybody's pulling in the same direction?
Yeah, I know. I think that is a crucial question, and there's sort of that issue's been ripe for a bit. And it's unclear exactly where they're going to go, but I think there has to be some rationalization of this ecosystem, so you can both continue to foster kind of the lots of flowers in different areas. But if you want, a lot of times if you let 1,000 flowers bloom, you're going to get a lot of weeds in there too, right? So how do you separate the wheat from the chaff, or whatever analogy you want to use? But I think having a great, giving all responsibility to like DIU, for instance, is not the right model. But I think there's definitely a rationalization, at least in terms of standards or approaches that would be useful to help these efforts be mutually reinforcing.
Always love getting insight from you, Jerry. Thanks very much for coming on the program today.
Great to be with you, Francis.
You can read more about both the programs Jerry talked about on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The FedGov Today podcast returns on Monday, a preliminary thumbs up for the acquisition reform Pentagon Secretary Pete Hegseth proposed today. Former Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition Nick Girton is on Monday's FedGov Today podcast. He'll tell you what's included in that reform. If you don't want to miss that, you can follow the FedGov Today podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, on the FedGov Today YouTube channel, or on demand at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Have a great weekend. Talk to you Monday. Thanks for listening.